Before I was even born, my father was in the Congress of the United States, Thomas D'Alessandro Jr. He was okay, let's hear it for Dad. He was, as a little teenager, a Shabbat Goy. So he spoke Yiddish. So as he grew up in that, and he was an orator, he was a great speaker and all the rest, and he had a love for the idea of a Jewish state in what was then called Palestine. So when he was older and he went to Congress, this was one of his big issues. He worshipped at the shrine of Franklin Roosevelt. He was a New Deal Democrat. He worshipped at the shrine of Franklin Roosevelt. But he disagreed with him on two very strong points. One was on the treatment of Jewish people in Europe that he wanted to call more attention to. And two, the second was the establishment of a Jewish state in what was then known as Palestine.
Well, the question was, if Iran were to launch a nuclear attack on Israel, what would our response be? And I want the Iranians to know that if I'm the president, we will attack Iran.
So, Leslie, there has been a lot of speculation about whether Israel would go it alone, would attack Iran all on its own. What does Mayor Dagan say about that?
Well, he thinks it's a mistake generally to make it an Israeli-Iranian issue. It should be an international issue. Somehow the Saudis should be encouraged to speak up and pressure the United States. And what he really would like to happen is Israel sits back and the Americans do it for the Israelis. It would then be internationalized. He knows that Israel will be attacked, whoever does it, but they'll be attacked less. And what he's most worried about is the retaliation.
Mr. Speaker, under U.S. law, it is illegal for you or me or any American to provide any type of assistance to al-Qaeda, ISIS, or other terrorist groups. If we broke this law, we'd be thrown in jail. Yet the U.S. government's been violating this law for years, directly and indirectly supporting allies and partners of groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS, with money, weapons, intelligence, and other support in their fight to overthrow the Syrian government. A recent New York Times article confirmed that rebel groups supported by the U.S., quote, have entered into battlefield alliances with the affiliate of al-Qaeda in Syria, formerly known as al-Nusra. The Wall Street Journal reports that rebel groups are, quote, doubling down on their alliance with al-Qaeda. This alliance has rendered the phrase moderate rebels meaningless. We must stop this madness. We must stop arming terrorists. I'm introducing the Stop Arming Terrorists Act today to prohibit taxpayer dollars from being used to support terrorists. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Things are going on right now that you don't know about, that I don't know about, that nobody, right now, there are things that are going on that you have so-called people that you think are on our side, and they're not reporting it, they're not talking about it, and in some cases they're involved with it. I mean, look, I'll give you an example. Some of our so-called allies that we work with and we protect them militarily, they're sending massive amounts of money to ISIS and to Al-Qaeda and to others.
Who are you talking about there?
You know who it is. What do I have to bring it up for? You know who it is.
Because you're running for president. Are you talking about the Saudis?
Joe, other countries are giving massive amounts of money. People from other countries are giving massive amounts of money.
Are you saying the Saudis are doing this?
Of course they're doing it. Everybody knows that.
Okay. Any other countries?
There are, but I'm not going to say it because I have a lot of relationships with people. But there are. And you know that, and everybody knows that, and nobody says it. Nobody talks about it.
But you're not even saying the countries that are doing it right now. Why aren't you willing to name those? You say you have a lot of relationships there.
All you have to do is check your records, and our government knows the countries, and one of them happens to be Saudi Arabia, and our government knows that. And why aren't we doing anything about it? Why aren't we being firm as to why are we allowing that to happen?
So why don't you think we are?
What?
Why don't you think we are doing anything about it?
Because I think we have an incompetent president.
Our view is it should be a very short period.
Quite often about the credibility of the UN, and it seems
so has Secretary Rice
yes,
recently.
and Rice has as well, but that seems to work in your favor when they do what you want them to do. But you violated the UN Charter when you went to war against Iraq, and you consistently lied to us about the reasons that we went to war. and this war was drawn up in Herzliya, Israel in 1996 with the project of a new American century. And, you know, why do you have credibility other than that you've just got the biggest guns?
May I ask what media outlet you're from?
Muslims Weekly.
I see. We did not violate the UN Charter in the war to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and that plan was not drawn up in Herzliya at the Project for a New American Century.
Whatever stage of development they might be in their nuclear weapons program in the next 10 years, during which they might foolishly consider launching an attack on Israel, we would be able to totally obliterate them. That's a terrible thing to say, but those people who run Iran need to understand that, because that perhaps will deter them from doing something that would be reckless, foolish, and tragic.
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to this resolution, not because I am taking sides and picking who the bad guys are and who the good guys are, but I'm looking at this more from the angle of being a United States citizen, an American, and I think resolutions like this really do us great harm. In many ways, what's happening in the Middle East, and in particular with Gaza right now, we have some moral responsibility for both sides in a way, because we provide help and funding for both Arab nations and Israel. And so we definitely have a moral responsibility, and especially now today, the weapons being used to kill so many Palestinians are American weapons, and American funds essentially are being used for this. But there's a political liability which I think is something that we fail to look at, because too often there's so much blowback from our intervention in areas that we shouldn't be involved in. You know, Hamas, if you look at the history, you'll find out that Hamas was encouraged and really started by Israel, because they wanted Hamas to counteract Yasser Arafat. And you say, well, yeah, that was better then and served its purpose, but we didn't want Hamas to do this. So then we as Americans say, well, we have such a good system, we're going to impose this on the world. We're going to invade Iraq and teach people how to be Democrats. We want free elections. So we encourage the Palestinians to have a free election. They do, and they elect Hamas. So we first indirectly and directly through Israel help establish Hamas. Then we have an election. Then Hamas becomes dominant, so we have to kill them. You know, it just doesn't make sense. During the 80s, you know, we were allied with Osama bin Laden. And we were contending with the Soviets. It was at that time our CIA thought it was good if we radicalized the Muslim world. So we financed the madrasa schools to radicalize the Muslims in order to compete with the Soviets. There's too much blowback. There's a lot of reasons why we should oppose this resolution. It is not in the interest of the United States. It's not in the interest of Israel either.
Okay, well, here in the West, especially here in the West, you hear a lot of this rhetoric about religion, Islam, ISIS being the responsibility of certain Islamic scholars or Islamic groups. You hear lots of people say it's the responsibility of the Shia-led government in Baghdad, the mistakes that they've made in the recent years. You hear people say it's the fault of Assad and obviously the repression in Syria. You hear people blame the Gulf countries for allegedly funding some of these groups. Very conveniently, I often find, we hear very little about America's own responsibility in this conflict, in this problem. Isn't it the case, General, that there would be no ISIL today in Iraq if the US hadn't invaded and occupied Iraq in 2003?
Yeah, I think that looking back, there were a number of strategic errors that were made. You have to look back over, 50, 60, 70 years. And you can even look back longer, but we definitely put fuel on a fire that was
by invading and the behavior
that had some embers there. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt. There's no doubt. I mean, when we, history will not be kind to the decisions that were made, certainly in 2003.
And here's the thing, I don't really
going into Iraq, definitely not.
And not just with Iraq, obviously there's Syria. You're on record as saying the handling of Syria by this administration has been a mistake. Many people would argue that the US actually saw the rise of ISIL coming and turned a blind eye, or even encouraged it as a counterpoint to Assad. And a secret analysis by the agency you ran, the Defense Intelligence Agency, in August 2012 said, and I quote, "There is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist," it's not secret anymore, it was released under FOI. The quote is, "There is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria, and this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want in order to isolate the Syrian regime." The US saw the ISIL caliphate coming and did nothing.
Yeah, I think that where we missed the point, I mean, where we totally blew it, I think, was in the very beginning. I mean, we're talking 4 years now into this effort in Syria. Most people won't even remember. It's only been a couple of years. The Free Syrian Army, that movement. I mean, where are they today? Al-Nusra, where are they today? And how much have they changed? When you don't get in and help somebody, they're going to find other means to achieve their goals. And I think right now what we have allowed is...
Hold on, you were helping them in 2012.
We've allowed this extremist... You know, these extremist militants to come in.
But why did you allow them to do that, General? You were in post. You were the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Well, those are policy.
I took the liberty of printing out that document.
Yeah.
This is the memo I quoted from. Did you see this document in 2012? Was this come across your table?
Yeah. I paid very close attention to all this.
So when you saw this, did you not pick up a phone and saying, "What on earth are we doing supporting these Syrian rebels?"
That kind of information is presented, and
what did you do about it?
Those become. I argued about it.
Did you say we shouldn't be supporting these groups?
I did. I mean, we argued about the different groups that were there, and we said, you know, who is it that is involved here? And I will tell you that I do believe that the intelligence was very clear, and now it's a matter of whether or not policy is going to be as clear and as defining and as precise as it needs to be, and I don't believe it was.
Just on what you're saying, just to clarify here, you're saying today my understanding is you're saying we should have backed the rebels. You're saying in government you agreed with this analyst.
We should have done more earlier on in this effort, you know, than we did.
But in 2012, which was 3 years ago, let's just be clear, just for the sake of our viewers. In 2012, your agency was saying, quote, "The Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria."
Mm-hmm.
In 2012, the US was helping coordinate arms transfers to those same groups. Why did you not stop that if you're worried about the rise of quote-unquote Islamic extremism?
I mean, I hate to say it's not my job, but my job was to ensure that the accuracy of our intelligence that was being presented was as good as it could be. And I will tell you, it goes before 2012. I mean, when we were in Iraq, and we still had decisions to be made before there was a decision to pull out of Iraq in 2011. I mean, it was very clear what we were going to face.
Well, I admire your frankness on this subject.
Very clear what we were going to face.
Let me just take one before we move on, just to clarify once more. You are basically saying that even in government at the time, you knew those groups were around, you saw this analysis, and you were arguing against it. But who wasn't listening?
I think the administration.
The administration turned a blind eye to your analysis.
I don't know if they turned a blind eye. I think it was a decision. I think it was a willful decision.
A willful decision to go support an insurgency that had Salafists, Al-Qaeda, and
well,
Muslim Brotherhood.
A willful decision to do what they're doing, which you'd have to really ask the president, what is it that he actually is doing with the policy that is in place, because it is very, very confusing. I'm sitting here today, Mehdi, and I can't tell you exactly what that is. And I've been at this for a long time. Okay,
well, let's go back to Iraq. I just want to ask you one last question about Iraq. Many would argue that the Iraq invasion was a recruiting sergeant for extremists and terrorists. You seem to have conceded partly that earlier on in this interview. You said that
I think it was a strategic mistake. I think history will not be kind.
But let me just get very specific on Iraq. U.S. prisons in Iraq are believed to have helped radicalize thousands of young Iraqis who passed through them.
Absolutely.
Not just through torture, but through providing a recruiting ground, a meeting place, a training facility for the very same militants that the U.S. is now bombing. I think 17 of the top 25
there's no doubt that the prison system that was the Iraqi prison system became places, training ground, the training ground for what we're facing
today. So it wasn't
today.
just 2003 that U.S. poured fuel on the fire. It was much later on as well.
Well, I don't think it was so much. It's not the U.S. so much.
Let me quote your former colleague, Major General Douglas Stone, who ran the U.S. detention system in Iraq. He said he called the U.S. prison system a jihadi university that was breeding more terrorists.
Yeah, I believe that. And he ran them. I believe that.
So it's not just the Iraqis, as you just said. It's the Americans.
I went down there. Well, I mean, what we did was we allowed things to happen in those prisons, in those detention facilities, in Camp Cropper and Camp Bucca, to where guys like al-Baghdadi spawned, and others as well. And then when we turned those detention facilities over to Iraq, that became far worse because there was no standards in those prisons at all. At least we had standards.
Let's talk about standards. You were a senior official in the Joint Special Operations Command at that time, JSOC, which is the kind of elite, top-secret unit responsible for the killing of Osama bin Laden, among other things. You've been described as the father of the modern JSOC. And you mentioned Camp Bucca and Camp Cropper, and you mentioned standards. You didn't mention Camp Nama in Iraq, which was nicknamed Nasty Ass Military Area, and where, according to a New York Times investigation, US interrogators beat prisoners with rifle butts, spat in their faces, and used them for target practice in a game of paintball, where the motto was no blood, no foul, meaning interrogators couldn't be prosecuted if a detainee didn't visibly bleed. Are you telling me, A, those are standards you're proud of, and B, that didn't help in the rise of ISIL?
No. I mean, obviously, no. I mean, those are not standards. They're not standards that I will ever be proud of. And my role, my personal role, when you say the father of, whatever, what I was asked to do, and this was post-Abu Ghraib, so I was responsible for training interrogators.
Who then went and abused these Iraqis.
Who then went in. I mean, so we saw what was happening, but it's not the training that we were giving these people. When we saw what was happening inside of the whole Abu Ghraib scandal, my role, and it was July of 2004, I was asked to come in and basically fix that problem. We shut that place down as fast as I could.
Listen to the verdict of Human Rights Watch in their report on Camp Nama. Military intelligence battalions systematized the use of abusive techniques in Iraq in 2003-04, and military intelligence interrogators, including officers, are implicated in widespread abuses during that time. How can you say you don't have any responsibility for what those interrogators did?
I always feel like I have responsibility. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I don't have responsibility. We all have responsibility, but
you didn't tell them to do what they did.
No, they're not trained. They weren't trained to do that.
So
this is poor leadership at its finest, if that's appropriate to say. There was no accountability at that time.
What accountability did you bring in general?
Accountability was to shut it down and to standardize it.
Human Rights Watch says that Red Cross was blocked from Camp
Nama. From Camp Nama.
Why?
You'll have to ask the folks that ran Camp Nama.
You were one of the commanding officers who turned up to clean them up?
I was the one that shut it down. I was the one that helped shut it down.
Did you call for Red Cross to be allowed in internal conversations?
We did. Eventually, we did.
Human Rights Watch says there are few indications the military undertook any systematic efforts
not in Camp Nama,
to investigate and prosecute abuses.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Human Rights Watch says there were few indications the military undertook any systematic efforts to investigate or prosecute abuses.
That's not true. There were individuals in Iraq and in Afghanistan that came under investigation, and many were found, those investigations were found substantiated, and those individuals were punished.
How many interrogators from Camp Nama were prosecuted in a court of law?
I don't know. I don't
know.
I don't
because internal punishments don't really count, though, do they?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that our entire system is guilty. I think our entire system at that time was guilty. It was guilty of just totally inappropriate behavior on the part of what we accept.
Doesn't U.S. law and international law say that if you commit torture, you should be prosecuted in a court? You don't just get a slap on the wrist. So why haven't more people been prosecuted in court?
I mean, you'd have to. I hope that as more and more information comes out, that people are held accountable.
You have that information in your head, presumably. You went there and you shut it down.
I know the ones that I was aware of, which was quite a few.
Let's talk about what you are aware of. You're on record as saying that you yourself physically interrogated detainees, that you've been, quote, personally involved in thousands of interrogation operations. Just to clarify, did those interrogations that you were involved in, General, ever involve torture?
No.
And when we say torture, are we both agreeing on the definition of torture?
Every single one that I was involved in, I have no problems with.
No waterboarding?
None of that. Nope, none of that.
No beatings, no sleep deprivation?
Nope.
None of that stuff?
Nope.
None of the stuff we've heard about all those abuses?
Nope. That's right.
The reason I ask is...
if I was asked to do anything, Mehdi, I was asked to take the standards that we were training and take the new doctrine that came out and get this thing under control. Again, history is not going to look kind on those actions that you're describing right now, and we should be held accountable for many, many years to come.
The reason I ask about your role is Esquire magazine reported in 2009, they quoted a soldier from Camp Nama who said that a colonel named Mike was present in the interrogations when a lot of those abuses were going on. Was that Colonel you, General?
No. No.
So you were never present when any of those
in
abuses?
2009, that was already...
No, that wasn't when it was reported, but he's talking about the
no. I'll give you my time in Camp Nama lasted about 3 days.
Whether it's interrogations or drone strikes or assassinations or renditions or night raids or whatever it is, do you believe that your work in that so-called shadow war resulted in America being more secure today than it was after 9/11? Because 14 years after 9/11, all the war on terror seems to have given us is more war and more terror. It doesn't look like a success from where I'm sitting.
I think that we have invested in more conflict instead of actually investing in solutions.
You tell the story about how you tried to find out what they call the Mossad when they deal with publicly?
I thought it was a reasonable question, but the trouble is you can't pick up the phone book. There's no Langley in Israel that you can look up, CIA, or in our case, the Mossad. We thought we should ask, what shall we call it in English? You can translate the Hebrew words, as I said, Mossad is institute, but when they write a letter to their friends in the CIA or the British intelligence, what do they call themselves? It took a while. It was a matter of asking the Prime Minister's spokesman. The best you could do, because officially the Mossad is under the Prime Minister's office. And I think he sort of wondered why you want to know and all that, so we explained. And he came up with the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. I mean, if it were to have initials, it would be ISIS. Just simple words like that. Interestingly enough, kind of a British model. The British don't really like the names MI5 and MI6 for their foreign service. They prefer SIS, Secret Intelligence Service.
What was the toughest bit of information to gather for this book?
As I've said before, this aspect of our strategy was moving too slowly, but the fall of Ramadi has galvanized the Iraqi government. So with the additional steps I ordered last month, we're speeding up training of ISIL forces, including volunteers from Sunni tribes in Anbar province.
Still on the subject of securing America on nuclear weapons, President Obama reportedly considered changing the nation's long-standing policy on first use. Do you support the current policy? Mr. Trump, you have 2 minutes on that.
Well, I have to say that, for what Secretary Clinton was saying about nuclear with Russia, she's very cavalier in the way she talks about various countries. But Russia's been expanding. They have a much newer capability than we do. We have not been updating from the new standpoint. I looked the other night, I was seeing B-52s. They're old enough that your father, your grandfather could be flying them. We are not keeping up with other countries. I would like everybody to end it, just get rid of it, but I would certainly not do first strike. I think that once the nuclear alternative happens, it's over. At the same time, we have to be prepared. I can't take anything off the table because you look at some of these countries, you look at North Korea, we're doing nothing there. China should solve that problem for us. China should go into North Korea. China is totally powerful as it relates to North Korea. And by the way, another one powerful is the worst deal I think I've ever seen negotiated that you started is the Iran deal. Iran is one of their biggest trading partners. Iran has power over North Korea. And when they made that horrible deal with Iran, they should have included the fact that they do something with respect to North Korea. And they should have done something with respect to Yemen and all these other places. And when asked to Secretary Kerry, why didn't you do that? Why didn't you add other things into the deal? One of the great giveaways of all time, including $400 million in cash. Nobody's ever seen that before. That turned out to be wrong. It was actually $1.7 billion in cash. Obviously, I guess, for the hostages, it certainly looks that way. So you say to yourself, why didn't they make the right deal? This is one of the worst deals ever made by any country in history. The deal with Iran will lead to nuclear problems. All they have to do is sit back 10 years, and they don't have to do much, and they're going to end up getting nuclear. I met with Bibi Netanyahu the other day. Believe me, he is not a happy camper.
Why are we in New York? I thought we were going to the Grand Canyon.
Well, I just thought we should stop and pay our respects.
Ground Zero. So this is where the first guy got AIDS.
Peter, this is the site of the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
Oh, so Saddam Hussein did this?
No.
The Iraqi army?
No.
Some guys from Iraq?
No.
That one lady who visited Iraq that one time?
No, Peter, Iraq had nothing to do with this. It was a bunch of Saudi Arabians, Lebanese, and Egyptians financed by a Saudi Arabian guy living in Afghanistan and sheltered by Pakistanis.
So you're saying we need to invade Iran?
want to answer?